The rancher's horse refused to enter the river, what he saw beneath the water. The horse stopped at the river. Before we ride into this story, take a moment to drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from, what town or city you're calling home tonight. And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now lean back, get comfortable, and enjoy the story. The western night glowed silver. The moon hung low, casting its light across a river still as glass. Elias Carter pulled the reins ready to cross, but Maverick stopped, dead still. The horse tossed his head, hooves striking the ground, eyes wide with a fear Elias had never seen. The wind swept through the willows. Maverick let out a broken, trembling cry, and in that sound was no fear of water, but fear of something hidden beneath it. The man and the sleeping memory. On the high plains of the West, late in the 19th century, the wind never stopped. It carried dust, the smell of old fires, and the cry of crows slicing across the silver sky. At the edge of a forgotten town stood a ranch, its walls faded, its porch groaning with every gust. And inside lived one man, Elias Carter. Once he was a gunslinger. Once there was laughter in his home. But his wife and child died by the river that runs near the ranch. Folks called it an accident. Elias called it a shadow. Now his only companion was Maverick, the loyal horse that had carried him through storms and silence. Elias no longer rode into town, no longer sought company. He buried his past like it never existed, but some nights he woke to the sound of that river whispering through the dark, a reminder that the past never truly sleeps. And I leave you with this question. If you were Elias, living alone on a ranch with nothing but the wind and a horse's breath, what would you do? Part 1. The Horse's Sign. Evening descended slowly like a gray blanket being drawn across the back of the prairie. The trail wound between mounds of dry grass, quiet as an old scar etched into the earth. Elias Carter rode silently in the saddle, his hand steady on Maverick's reins. The leather creaked with each shift of his weight, the sound of hide against hide, a whisper between two companions who had weathered many seasons of storm together. On the pack wagon, a few sacks of flour and rolls of barbed wire rattled in the ruts, clinking against each other. Ruth Miller sat in the back, clutching her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders. She adjusted her worn gloves, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, where the trail spilled into a valley shaped like a cupped hand with a river curling at its base. The smell of water drifted up, mixed with the scorched scent of grass, sharp, earthy, and cold. From afar, a gunshot cracked dry solitary and then fell silent. The echo carried across the open range, skimming the surface of the grass like the shadow of a stray bird. Maverick flicked his ears, breath puffing out in pale white wisps. No voices followed, no curses, only the fading smoke of dusk and the endless sigh of wind combing through brittle weeds. On the horizon, a dust storm swept sideways, not a great wall, but a thin veil sliding across the sky, sprinkling golden grit over Elias's coat and across Ruth's hair. The dust stung their cheeks, salty on the lips. Elias tugged his hat brim lower and said nothing. He was used to sudden storms, just as he was used to winters that stretched long without laughter. To the west, a herd of cattle, startled by something unseen, stampeded across a field. Calves bolted like tumbling waves, hooves pounding in chaotic rhythm before scattering into the fading light. Life in the west was like that 1 minute calm the next, driven by wind and fear. Ruth quietly retied the ropes that secured their load. She didn't ask questions. On Elias's ranch, silence was the kindest language. She only found steadiness when her eyes landed on Maverick, his coat, dark and damp-looking, his cropped mane shivering slightly. That horse was like a piece of the land itself, solid, steady, without flourish. Reach the river before the moon's up. Elias muttered, his voice rough as if speaking to himself. Ruth nodded gently, hugging her sweater closer. She noticed his hands broad-scarred but holding the reins with the gentleness of someone carrying a secret. In this country, survival meant knowing how to hold reins that way and how to hold silence the same way. The sun folded shut, its red glow fading into gray waves of grass. The trail dipped toward a fringe of willows, their narrow leaves trembling in the breeze. The smell of water grew stronger, a sharp, familiar scent that Elias had avoided naming for years. The willows parted and the river lay bare, a bed of pale stones spread wide like an exposed ribcage. The current looked calm, the surface reflecting the last pink smears of sky. But men of the West knew the stillest waters often hid the fiercest pull beneath. Elias stopped the wagon at a flat boulder, its surface darkened from years of water licking its edges. He had crossed here 100 times before. Once, when he still had a family, he had carried his boy across this very crossing, the child's laughter, small as sand slipping into a pocket. Now the memory pressed at the base of his skull like a cold clamp. Touch it, and it hurt. Leave it, and it choked. Maverick lowered his head to sniff the water. His breath came faster. Ears pricked, body rigid, front hooves edging toward the riverbank, but frozen as if rooted in stone. Ruth climbed down, shook dust from her skirt, and cautiously laid a hand on the horse's neck. "Easy," she whispered. Her palm was warm, her pulse quick. She had walked past many doorways where whispers followed her, but here no one asked where she came from, and she had no need to answer. Tonight, though, something pressed heavy in her chest. Across the bank, 2 riders appeared, watching. They lingered a moment, eyes sharp as suspicion between strangers, then disappeared into the willows. In the West, people looked at each other longer than they looked at the sky, not out of care, but to measure risk. Ruth pulled her scarf higher across her face. Elias didn't turn his head, but his shoulders tightened. He hated the feeling of being counted. A muffled train whistle drifted through the air, carried by wind before sinking over the water. The new railroads had carved through much of the prairie, bringing promise and stealing plenty in return. Elias had thought about those trains once, then let the thought die. He couldn't keep up with them. He had his own river to cross. He loosened the reins. Maverick lifted a hoof, then set it back. Then the water kissed his shoe, trembling faintly like a thought unspoken. "Go on," Elias murmured. No whip. He never needed one. Between him and the horse was a quiet, packed trust, until one of them no longer could. Ruth picked up a willow twig and tossed it into the current. The branch spun lightly, tilted, then slipped into a narrow thread of current stretched taut as string. Her lips pressed thin. She remembered a silk scarf drifting just the same years ago, floating softly, silently, then yanked under without warning. The memory flared sharp as a knife and faded just as quick. Elias's gaze followed the branch, eyes narrowing. From behind, the wind shifted, carrying the tang of rust and old ash, the smell of burned-out stables of that night when gunfire sent cattle crashing through fences, scattering into darkness. Places like that kept everything tracks mud, the scent of fear. Maverick snorted hard, backing half a step, his body taut as a drawn bow. Ruth glanced at Elias. He gave a single deliberate nod. In that nod was both command and consent, permission for the horse to fear. The sky emptied of sunset, poured silver blue into the river. The moon rose halfway, an old coin snagged on willow branches. Elias stepped down from the wagon, walked to the water's edge. His boots ground against the stones as if treading a private history. He drew the reins forward gently, voice low. "Come on." Maverick shifted forward 1 step, then froze hard. His eyes widened, the black of them deep as sinkholes. Ears twisted sharply, listening for something only he could hear. Not frogs, not rolling pebbles. Something else, the kind of thing animals sensed through water, through mud, through silence, a warning with no voice. Ruth came closer, pressing her palm against his chest where breath hammered under skin. "It's all right," she murmured, though her words trembled back at her. From the wagon came the rattle of shifting cargo wire, rolling metal, clinking against metal like warped chimes. Small noises stitched themselves into a tense rhythm, the rhythm of western nights when gunshots could spark from anywhere at any time. Elias pressed his scarred fingers along Maverick's neck, tracing the faint marks of old nails. "You've carried me through floods, through snow," he whispered. "Don't stop here." Maverick blinked, groaned softly, then like a shadow retreating, stepped back 2 full paces. His tail whipped sideways, stirring dust into a pale veil. Across the river, the water glimmered not from anything below, but from moonlight, breaking across small ripples. Still in that moment, Elias heard it from deep within himself, a buried sob, a voice calling a name tangled with the river's murmur. He didn't look at Ruth. He kept his eyes on the water, clinging to the present, as if gripping driftwood, refusing to be dragged back into the undertow of memory. Ruth reached into her coat and pulled out a dark cloth, her usual head covering for damp nights. She tried looping it over Maverick's eyes, the trick handlers used to steady frightened animals. But the moment the fabric brushed his lashes, the horse jerked violently, flinging it into the mud. His whinny broke out, not angry, but long and low, a cry of warning, sharp with refusal. On the ridge above, a small whirl of dust spiraled, then fell apart. The river's smell tonight was not the same. It carried something metallic, blurred like the trace left by boots waiting unseen. Ruth inhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the water's unnerving stillness. Travelers often said, if the water lies flat, it's because something beneath is waiting. Not fish, not stone, something truer. Not stone, something. Elias dropped the reins and stepped back half a pace. He locked eyes with the horse. The wind slid between them. And in that silence, he understood Maverick wasn't afraid of the river. He feared a memory that still lived within its depths, a shadow only animals could still sense. Ruth circled to the back of the wagon, checking the wheel pins, with fingers stiff from cold mud. A flash of her own memory stabbed another riverbank, another night soldiers, pushing a skiff into reeds, the gleam of a badge in fog. The thought cut quick, then vanished. She pulled her sleeve down, covering it up. Here for now, it was only omen. A willow branch swept across her cheek. Somewhere nearby, an owl shifted perches and called, once short and low. The river flowed on calm to the point of deceit. But Maverick, seasoned, loyal, scarred by years, stood rigid, refusing to move. And in that refusal, in a land where survival always pressed forward, that was the truest storm of all. Maverick stomped hard against the ground. Pebbles skittered loose, clattering down toward the water's edge. The sound rang out like a hoarse bell, striking something buried deep in Elias's memory. He lifted his head, brows drawn tight, a dark crease shadowing his face. For a heartbeat, Ruth thought the horse might rear and bolt, but it didn't. It stood its ground, trembling from withers to hooves. Each breath burst white into the night air, ears twitching, eyes wide, locked not on Elias, not on Ruth, but on the river's surface where the moonlight spread silver like a shattered mirror. Ruth instinctively stepped back half a pace, clutching her shawl tight. A strange sensation welled inside her, not fear exactly, not panic either, but something older. A reminder. Long ago, on another night, she had heard a horse scream the same way, just moments before a man collapsed into the reeds. Tonight, that sound came back, slicing into the deepest part of her memory. Across the water, half hidden by willow shadows, two riders appeared once more. They did not approach, nor did they speak. They simply sat astride their horses still, and silent eyes glinting like blades in the half-moon. A sliver of light flickered against the metal at one man's belt. Ruth shivered. Elias didn't look, but he knew. After years on the frontier, he recognized such stares, part challenge, part warning, part waiting. The wind swept across the plain, carrying dust and river damp together. The creak of saddle leather echoed in Elias's ears, the sharp scent of tanned hide mingling with the cold musk of water. He tightened his grip on the reins, feeling every tremor coursing through Maverick's muscles. This was no stubbornness. This was deep, primal fear. Ruth's breath quivered. Her eyes widened. Elias, it's like he sees something. Elias didn't answer. Between the man and the horse, an unspoken pact already existed. If Maverick was afraid, then the river was keeping a secret. Moonlight spread wider, silvering the current. The water lay still, glassy, almost innocent. Yet Maverick backed away, stiff-legged, neighing with a raw, drawn-out cry, eyes fixed on some invisible figure beneath the ripples. And suddenly, Elias remembered. A night long ago. A faint cry for help, the churn of dark water, the wooden skiff capsizing. He had once convinced himself it was an accident. He had once told himself he'd misheard. But now Maverick's refusal crushed his chest like a vice. The horse wasn't afraid of the river. He feared what was buried within it. On the sandy bank, Ruth gripped the wagon's side rail. She glanced at Elias, and saw the rigid mask of his face, his hand shaking faintly on the reins. In that instant, she knew a door in his memory was about to swing open. And when it did, neither of them would ever go back. The wind shifted. Willow leaves fell and floated downstream, vanishing into the current. Silence closed in, broken only by Maverick's heavy, ragged breathing. Elias bent low, whispering hoarsely into the horse's ear, "You see what I've tried to forget." "Don't you?" Maverick gave no answer, but his eyes shimmered like a drop of water trembling before it breaks. That silence itself was the warning. The river showed no waves that night. Yet in Elias's eyes, each ripple was an old wound split open again. Ruth stood close, her palms damp with sweat, too afraid to speak. Under the moonlight, one truth stood clear. Maverick had seen something. Something man had tried to bury for years, but the animal refused to ignore. So I'll leave the question with you. If you were Elias, would you trust the horse's fear or force it into the river? Drop your answer in the comments below. Part 2. The light beneath the water. Moonlight draped across the willow branches, spilling silver over the river like a sheet of glass. At first glance, the current looked harmless, almost gentle. Elias stood on the flat stone ledge, slipping off his worn gloves to reveal fingers cracked and raw from wind and cold. He drew a long breath, inhaling the river itself, the mud, the weeds, and a faint metallic sting that burned the back of his nose. Behind him, Ruth held a storm lantern. Its glow was nothing compared to the moon, just a small golden halo trembling around her wrist. Maverick never once looked away from the water. Each breath puffed white in the mist ears, flicking the saddle creaking beneath him like an old man sighing. "Hold the wagon," Elias muttered, voice rough as salt. Ruth nodded, bracing the wheels with stones tying the reins to a willow root. She glanced toward the prairie. A thin sandstorm drifted like a curtain across the fields, dust sprinkling gold into the night. Somewhere in the distance, a gunshot cracked, dry, abrupt, and gone. Cattle scattered, hooves drumming the earth, then silence returned, as if nothing had happened. Elias tied a rope around his waist, the other end fastened to a willow root, the kind of habit learned from crossing thawed rivers in spring. He stepped down. The water seized his ankle like a cold hand from the past. His chest clenched tight with a memory he refused to name. He went deeper, knees, then thighs. The current that had looked lazy suddenly pressed hard against his legs, rolling mud across his skin. "Careful, the rocks are slick." Ruth called, her breath sharp. She listened to the water slap against stone, steady, steady, like an old clock ticking backward. On the far bank, the two horsemen appeared again, barely shapes in the shadows near the willows. They stopped, turned their horses toward the scene, 2 men, 1 horse watching. No words, only the silent weight of suspicion drifting across the river. A gust carried dust into Ruth's mouth, bitter with salt. She lowered her head, angling the lantern so her face wouldn't shine back across the water. Elias bent low. Water chilled his elbows, numbing his skin. He blinked against the silver glare, and there, just beneath the ripples, a thin glimmer like the head of a nail driven into mud flashing against the current. Not a reflection of moonlight. It pulsed against it, stubborn like an eye refusing to close. Maverick stamped a hoof, shaking the bridle. The brass bit jingled. He snorted, a long, quivering sound of fear held tight. Elias didn't turn. He waded deeper water at his waist, now palms scraping over slick stone. Inside his chest, another step echoed, an echo of a younger man carrying a child across this very crossing the last time he'd heard laughter break like glass. 2 more steps. Ruth urged, her eyes locked on the glow. Right at the edge. Elias nodded, shifted his weight. The current cinched his thighs like a belt. He leaned forward, hand plunging into silt, then froze. His fingers brushed cold metal. A spark jolted up his arm. He held his breath. The mud clung like silence. He raked through pebbles, sliding his hand deeper until his fingertips hooked on a sharp edge. He pulled. The object refused, wedged tight beneath a willow root, clawing out like ribs. Mud cracked apart, bubbles rising. The glow flared again, stronger, as if something had stirred it awake. "See it." Ruth crouched, lantern light spilling gold across his bloodied knuckles and the black pool. "Do you need enough?" Elias hissed. He yanked. Metal shrieked underwater, a sound that skinned his nerves. His hand slipped, raking against the root-tearing flesh. The taste of iron mixed with the stench of river mud. He didn't let go. Another gunshot cracked closer now, echoing down the bank like a slap to the ear. Maverick reared, trying to back away. Ruth spun, gripping the reins, whispering over and over, "Easy, easy." On the opposite bank, the riders shifted. One nudged his horse forward, cloak whipping open to reveal a flash of steel at his hip. Ruth swallowed hard. Elias braced, driving his shoulder into the current. The mud gave inch by inch, bubbles bursting. The object shifted, then jammed again. He shoved his arm deeper, wrist scraping a jagged edge. His middle finger found smooth surface etched with faint grooves. Letters. Buried letters. The wind howled, dragging the prairie storm down to the river. Dust sprayed over the water, moonlight scattering into 1,000 sharp shards, stabbing the eyes. Ruth shielded the lantern, fighting to keep the flame alive. The glimmer beneath the surface flickered, each pulse brighter, and each pulse locked Elias's chest tighter, harder, like stone sealing in his lungs. "Don't push too deep," Ruth warned, her voice steady only by force. The current's shifting. "Not yet," Elias rasped. The sound was raw, scraped from years of carrying debts too long unpaid. He twisted his hand, searching for leverage. His nails dug into muck. Something small brushed his wrist, a river shrimp darting by, cold as a splinter of sky. The object wobbled. A spike of light shot upward like a knife, slicing across his vision. In that single heartbeat, he saw not the whole image, but fragments, the star's edge gnawed by silt, one sharp point, then another. His hand recoiled as though burned. His chest seized, his heart clenched, strangled. Elias, Ruth called. Half a cry, half a prayer. Almost he groaned. But something inside him cracked like ice breaking underfoot. Then the moon vanished, swallowed whole by a black cloud. Darkness poured thick over the bank. The river's voice changed, rumbling low, heavy. The current slammed his hips, spun him off balance. The rope at his waist snapped taut. His knee slammed, rock pain flaring white. The object tore from his grip, sliding deeper into the river's throat. Maverick screamed, jerking back. Ruth fell to her knees, clinging to the bridle. "Wait." Elias raised his bleeding hand, gulped air like it might be his last. One more time. Ruth spun, the lantern heart pounding like a bird in a cage. She tore the lariat from the wagon post, flung it out. Elias caught it, looped it round his left wrist. The other end she tied to a willow root buried deep in the earth. He gave it a test pull. The root held fast, iron strong. Good. Elias rasped the D, snapping like bone. He dove. Water swallowed him whole. His world shrank to mud grit and the single shard of light the size of a fingernail. His right hand probed again, slower this time. He brushed mud aside with the back of his hand, gentle as brushing hair from a child's forehead. Shapes pressed back against his fingertips. Clearer now, the curve of a D, the line of an E, then a P. He didn't need the rest. Recognition hooked him like a barb. His gut wrenched. He sucked in river water, coughed soundlessly in the dark. A bullet screamed through the night, cutting the air above the river. It struck the water only a few yards from Elias, throwing up a spray that fell back like cold rain. "Get back from the bank, you fool!" Ruth hissed her words, snapping across the river, hitting the willows, then dying away. Across the way, the two riders pulled deeper into shadow. Their presence left only in the snort of a horse drawing air and the tiny flare of a match lit, then killed. Below, Elias wrenched at the object, still wedged tight in the riverbed. His thumb pressed into mud and caught the edge of wet leather. A thin strap, rotted but strong, hooked under a willow root, binding the thing in place like a silent gatekeeper. He groped for a knot, found none. Only a smooth rivet and the trace of old stitching. Maybe once it had been a leather pouch. His wrist burned numb. His lungs roared. He twisted the metal upright, heaved. It moved just barely. But it moved. The ground above trembled. Ruth spun her head. A neighbor's cattle, driven by the sandstorm, thundered down a low slope and broke toward the river. Hooves hammered rock, echoing like drums. The wagon tipped sideways. A coil of barbed wire slipped free, crashing against the stones. Maverick lunged, nearly bolting, but didn't. He planted his hooves, muscles straining, and dragged the wagon back half a yard, locking the wheels before they slid. "Good boy," Ruth breathed, knuckles white on the reins. She dropped to her knees, eyes never leaving the water. Elias under the river. Elias twisted harder, body writhing against the current. The object shifted with a sharp crack like a lock breaking. He tugged on the lariat signal. Then he broke the surface. Air slammed into his chest like a hammer. He gasped, mud and iron thick on his tongue. Ruth leaned forward. "What did you see?" Elias didn't answer at once. His eyes locked on the dark patch below, where the glow had flickered out. In his mind, letters burned, DEPU. He refused to finish the word. If he did, it would form something he had spent years denying. A star, a name, a badge once pinned on the chest of a man who had stared at Elias's wife for too long. Another gust swept the riverbank. Sand stung their skin like needles. Ruth squinted her eyes, tearing. She looked at Elias and saw his face pale as if the river had stolen part of his blood. "We'll need more rope," he said, strangely calm. "This time we pull the whole bag up." Bag, Ruth blinked. Leather down there. She scrambled to the wagon, yanked free a length of harness strap, hurled it to him. Elias wound it round his chest. He met Maverick's eyes. "Hold." The horse pawed the ground, braced back, every muscle set like stone. His ears folded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the water. Elias dove again. Across the river, another shot cracked. This one wasn't a warning. It was meant to erase something, to scatter tracks. The bullet struck stone, throwing sparks that hissed into the current. Ruth's throat burned with fury. Someone wanted the river's secret buried for good. Underwater silence pressed thick around Elias. His fingers clawed through rotted stitching, snapping the strap that held the object bound. It shifted loose. He looped the lariat, tied a knot with bloody hands. His chest seared, his eyes burned. In the murk, where moonlight could not reach, he glimpsed a shape, a wing. A wing with 5 points glimmering silver. He shut his eyes. His heart skipped a beat as if missing a step on a staircase. He yanked the rope. On shore, Ruth pulled. Maverick leaned back, hooves gouging the soil. The willow root groaned but held. Out of the mud rose a shadow, dripping, flashing a vein of silver, then fell back with a heavy splash, stopped by one last knot of earth. Elias strained in the water, shoving mud aside with his final strength. His lungs screamed. His eyes bulged. When at last he surfaced, lips blue, Ruth was already leaning over the rope. The thing glimmered once more beneath the current, a buried star demanding to be pulled free. Elias gripped the rock edge, body shaking, vision tunneling, until the world narrowed to that single shard of silver. "Did you get it?" Ruth whispered, her voice raw, barely air. "Not yet." Elias rasped, blood trailing from his wrist, vanishing into the current like a forgotten word. But almost. The river was black as ink, the crescent moon shattering across its rippling skin. Elias dove once more, the rope cinched around his waist like a cold embrace. His hands found the metal shape again, now more exposed, its sharp edges biting into his flesh, burning as if it wanted blood for release. On shore, Ruth braced the line, the storm lantern throwing a trembling halo across her face. The sandstorm swept lower, stinging the air, until her eyes watered. Maverick groaned deep in his chest, muscles tight as bowstrings, eyes wide and white. The horse did not bolt, but every sinew screamed. Far off, cattle thundered in panic. From the town, gunfire cracked a volley rolling across the plains, not close but enough to stretch the night taut as wire. All of it bled together, the waters churn, the ropes strain, the chaos of hooves and bullets into a wild hymn of the West, brutal, relentless, sacred. Elias twisted the metal inch by inch, as if dragging the past itself out of the earth. He tied the lariat firm and yanked twice signal. Ruth heaved. Maverick pulled. Slowly, the thing rose from the mud, flashing silver through the water, like a star breaking the surface. Elias's chest clenched. His heart missed a beat. In the silver, he saw his wife's face, his boy's laughter swallowed by the current long ago. A moan burst from his throat, drowned by the river. "Harder," Ruth cried, falling forward, rope slicing her palms raw. Blood welled, but she held. Maverick backed harder, hooves tearing up sod, dragging inches at a time. The willow roots screamed, fibers snapping like old bones. Then splash. A dark sodden weight burst free, slamming onto the gravel bank. Water exploded over Ruth, cold as knives. Maverick reared high, screaming to the sky, then landed, trembling sweat steaming off his hide. Elias surfaced, gasping face, purpled chest heaving. He clung to the bank, eyes fixed on the thing. The lump of mud lay still, dripping. Slowly the silt washed away, revealing a torn leather pouch. From its flap glinted silver, half buried, half exposed. A star, six-pointed, rusted, scarred, but still bright enough to stab Elias straight through the heart. His hand shook as he lifted it. The edge scraped his skin, drawing blood. But he did not let go. He stared, face twisted by shock and pain. He knew this badge. He had seen it 100 times, gleaming on the chest of a man who called himself Law, a man Elias had trusted, a man who stood there that night of the accident. Ruth staggered back, a hand clamped over her mouth. She knew that star too. Years ago, it had caught the firelight the night a knife pressed to her ribs, forcing her into flight. She trembled, saying nothing, cold flooding her veins. Elias lifted his eyes to hers. No question, no accusation, only a quiet breaking. Together they understood this had never been an accident. It was a crime, buried in mud. Maverick stepped close, pressing his head against Elias's shoulder, sides heaving as if to say, "This is why I would not cross the water." Elias gripped the badge, whispered hoarsely into the storm and gunfire drifting from afar. It was never chance. Never. The moon spread silver across the silent river, but in Elias's eyes it burned like a verdict carved in stone. Ruth clutched her shawl, tears rising, chest locked in grief. Maverick stood beside them both, breathing hard, a witness to truth at last unburied. And now I leave you with this question. If you were Ruth and the truth beneath that water tied to your own past, would you speak it to Elias tonight, or would you keep silent? Let me know in the comments. Part 3. The Silver Badge. The riverbank lay silent, broken only by wind sighing through the willows and the slap of water against stone. Elias stood rooted to the gravel, hand trembling as he raised what he had just pulled from the depths. Mud slid from his fingers, revealing a six-pointed silver badge, bent, rusted, yet gleaming with the sharp light of an unhealed wound. Blood from his torn hand seeped into the badge's grooves, staining its edges red. He clenched harder, forcing more blood, but he didn't feel the pain. The true wound lived inside his chest, carved years ago, the night a cry of Elias was swallowed by the river, dragging his wife and child with it. The wind rose, carrying grit and salt from the prairie as a sandstorm pushed closer. In the haze, Elias swore he saw his wife's face, hair plastered wet across her cheek, eyes wide with terror slipping behind the flash of this very badge. His chest tightened. Every memory he had buried was crawling back to the surface with the river's mud. Behind him, Ruth clutched the storm lantern, hands trembling. Its glow stretched Elias's shadow long and jagged across the sand. Her breathing hitched, chest heaving with each second. Maverick kept his gaze locked on the badge, snorting in short bursts, as though he too recognized the ghost Elias dared not name. Across the river, the two riders had not left. Their horses stood like black statues in the mist, their eyes gleaming like drawn knives. For an instant, moonlight glinted off metal at one rider's hip, maybe a gun, maybe another badge. Elias no longer cared. He understood enough. In the West, words are cheap. A single look held too long could become a sentence. And those stares, he knew them. He had felt them the night everything was taken, suspicion, judgment, cold indifference. Tonight they returned, slicing through dust, as if to remind him, you will never escape us. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter across her face, pulse pounding. She had lived beneath stares like these before, the kind that could exile a woman from her community with nothing more than a raised brow. Sweat slid down her spine despite the cold wind. Elias's grip tightened on the badge. Then suddenly he lifted his head, staring across the river. He angled the star so moonlight flashed off its face, reflecting straight into the rider's eyes. A small gesture, but it said everything I know. I've seen it. A gunshot cracked. The bullet struck the ground at Elias's feet, dirt exploding upward. Maverick reared, screaming. Ruth clutched the reins in panic. Elias did not move. His eyes stayed on the badge resolve carved in stone. Death could come, but the truth would not be buried again. The gunfire faded, but in Elias's mind a dozen others echoed at once. The splinter of wood, his son's cries, his wife screaming his name before the boat flipped into the whirlpool. It all replayed sharp as if it were happening again. And on the far bank stood a man silent, watching. The silver badge burned on his chest like a cruel verdict. He did not move. He did not help. He simply let them drown. Not an accident, Elias' rasped voice raw, breaking. It was never an accident. No tears fell, but his face cracked tight as drought-stricken earth. Maverick pressed his head into Elias's shoulder, snorting hard, trying to pull him back from the abyss. But Elias didn't resist this time. He let it all rush in, let it burn away the silence he had built for years. Ruth's chest clenched, her fingers dug into her shawl, teeth biting, until blood touched her tongue. She remembered her own night of flight, pursued through reeds by a man whose silver badge gleamed in the firelight. That same terror now braided with Elias's grief, flowing between them like one river. She whispered, trembling, "Elias, I know him. I saw him." His head snapped toward her. His eyes, bloodshot but blazing, shone like wildfire in a storm. For the first time in years, Elias was no longer the man who hid. He was the man standing face to face with truth. The sandstorm closed in dust, whipping across the riverbank, stinging like knives. Ruth pulled her shawl over her mouth, but her eyes stayed wide, burning with fear and resolve. Ever since she'd seen that badge, her whole body trembled like a prisoner trapped in iron bars. "Elias," she cried over the roar of the wind, her voice raw, "the man who wore this badge. I saw him, more than once." Elias snapped his gaze toward her. His eyes were dark as a pit, yet burning like a fire about to ignite. Ruth flinched back a step, then steadied herself, forcing the truth out. "The night you lost your family, I was nearby. I heard the screams. I saw him standing on the bank, the silver star blazing on his chest. He didn't save them. He just watched. And later, he hunted me. He's the one who drove me into hiding." Her words ripped through the wind, carried out over the prairie like an accusation hurled at the sky itself. Elias stood frozen, chest heaving, the badge trembling in his fist as if it were his own heart. Everything he had tried to deny was now confirmed by another witness. The truth had split the night in two. Across the river, the two riders stayed still, no more than shadows behind the veil of dust. Yet Elias felt their eyes fixed on him, eyes of men terrified that the truth was clawing its way back up from the mud. Maverick reared and let out a piercing cry, a sound that tore straight through the storm. The horse refused to stay silent. He too had been a witness. The moon broke through the clouds, spilling silver light across the riverbank. It struck the badge in Elias's hand, setting it ablaze, not just a piece of rusted metal anymore, but a verdict. He lifted it to eye level. His eyes glistened not with tears, but with fire. Slowly, every word a blade, he said, "Not an accident. This was murder." Ruth broke tears, spilling as her hands clasped tight against her chest, as if at last she wasn't alone with her nightmare. Maverick pressed his head into Elias's shoulder, breath ragged but steady, eyes weary yet resolute. Three exiles, each scarred in their own way, now bound by one truth. From the distance came the chaos of stampeding cattle, the echo of fading gunfire. The west itself seemed to hold its breath, earth trembling, wind howling, enemies watching from the dark. But here on the riverbank, Elias Carter had finally found what he'd been waiting for all these years, a reason to stop being silent. He clenched the badge jaw tight. His voice came low and rough, carrying both pain and a strange quiet hope. Justice never died. It only slept beneath the mud. And tonight, it's awake. In the moonlight, Elias, Ruth, and Maverick stood side by side, facing a river heavy with secrets now exposed. And the audience could feel it from this moment forward. The story was no longer about grief. It was about the fight for justice. If you were Elias holding that blood-stained badge in your hand, would you stay silent just to survive? or stand and face the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Part 4. Ruth's Confession. The night wind slid through the reeds, making the riverbank ripple like a field of silver hair. Moonlight shattered across the water, spilling over the stones, lighting up the hard lines on Elias's face. In his hand lay the tarnished silver star like a broken bone from the past. Silence pressed heavy. Only Maverick's ragged breaths and the whisper of reeds filled the night. Out on the prairie, a gunshot cracked sharp distance, sending cattle pounding in panic hooves, drumming against the hard earth. Dust swirled, choking the lantern's glow. Ruth stood beside Elias, the lantern trembling in her hands. She stared at the badge, her body locked tight. Old fear rose, old scars burning awake. Her lips parted, but only breath escaped. Elias turned his eyes, a storm of fury and grief, but beneath a glimmer waited the truth. Ruth clutched her worn shawl like it was her last anchor. The sandstorm whipped the air raw. Ruth bent, shielding her eyes, then forced herself to look at Elias. Her voice came broken, torn apart by the wind. "Elias, I saw him, the man with this badge, years ago before I came to your ranch." Elias froze. His chest heaved like a hammer had struck him. Ruth trembled harder, but she pressed on. "The night you lost your wife and child, I was near the river. I heard the screams. I saw the flash of silver on a man's chest. He was standing there. He didn't save them. He just watched." Her voice cracked, carried away by the thunder of cattle beyond. Every word was a blade slicing through the silence Elias had buried himself in for years. Ruth broke into sobs, not easing her pain, but burning her throat raw. And not just that she choked. He hunted me, him and his men. They wanted me silent. I ran, I hid, until I found you. The wind tore through, whipping Ruth's hair across her face. The lantern swung, casting frantic gold over her tear-streaked cheeks. Elias didn't move. In his hand, the badge gleamed like a sentence finally spoken aloud. He lowered his gaze, pressing the star into his bloody palm. He saw it as it had been that night, a cold light on the chest of the man who stood by and let it all happen. In a hoarse whisper, he said, just loud enough for the wind to carry, "Not an accident. He stood there, you saw it, and I knew it, and I buried it." Maverick snorted, stamping the earth ears pinned toward the two riders still watching from across the river. They didn't move, didn't fire again. Just two shadows knowing their secret had spilled out into the open. Ruth lifted her tear-bright eyes. "You're not alone in this," she said, voice broken yet unyielding. "He stole your family. He stole my youth. He scarred us both." And in that moment, the past and present collided. A man who lost his family, a woman who lost her years, a horse that lost its trust in the river. 3 lives bound now beneath a western sky alive with dust and gunfire. Elias looked at Ruth, and for the first time in years, his eyes held something beyond pain, not pity, not promise, but recognition, quiet and firm. "I see you. I believe you." The wind whipped harder now, flattening the reeds along the riverbank. Dust swirled into choking clouds, and the moonlight flickered like a trembling knife. Ruth staggered, clutching her shawl, then suddenly let it fall. There was no other way but to speak. Her voice shook ragged in the storm, but clear enough for Elias to hear. "That night, I was near the river, hiding in the reeds. I didn't dare scream, didn't dare breathe loud. And I saw him, the man. He was standing on the bank, just steps from your family. His chest shining because of this badge." Elias gripped the star so tight his nails split his skin. Blood seeped out, but he didn't flinch, his back stiff as stone, eyes locked ahead. Ruth's tears spilled as her voice cracked like glass. "He didn't jump in. He just stood there, watching, as if your family were nothing but punishment. When the boat flipped, when the screams faded." He turned away. He walked away, Elias, far off. The sound of panicked cattle rolled like thunder hooves pounding the earth. The herd scattered beneath the dusty sky, just as Ruth's heart thrashed, now frantic, terrified, unstoppable. After that, he came for me. Her words caught in her throat. He knew someone had seen. He and his men hunted me from the river all the way to town. I left everything, my home, my life, just to survive. And all these years I stayed silent, because I knew if I spoke, I'd die. The wind twisted into small whirlwinds, snapping Ruth's cloak against her body. She broke down, sobbing, hands shaking uncontrollably. Elias, you didn't just lose your family. I lost my life, and all of it, because of the man with this silver star. The night pressed down heavy. Elias stood unmoving, his face carved deep by years of pain. But in his eyes a fire sparked awake. He looked at Ruth not as a hired hand, but as a living witness, the one who had just handed him the key to unlock the past. Maverick stepped forward, mane whipping in the wind, pressing his head to his master's shoulder. His breath came hot, insistent, his eyes blazing as if to say, I remember. I saw it too. Elias laid his hand on the horse's neck, then raised the badge high. Moonlight struck the twisted star, flaring like a beacon. His voice, hoarse but iron strong, cut through the night. It was never an accident. No more lies. This is proof. This is justice buried in the mud. Ruth lifted her tear-soaked face, eyes wide. In that instant, Elias was no longer the man crushed by memory, but the rancher standing tall, ready to face an entire town. Two outcasts, one robbed of a family, the other of her youth, now bound by one truth. Far across the prairie, the last gunshot cracked, then silence swallowed it whole. The sandstorm faded, leaving a moonlit stillness sharp enough to cut. The night itself seemed to hold its breath as Elias spoke. Justice isn't dead. It's been waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. Ruth sobbed, but for the first time her tears carried a glimmer of light hope. On that riverbank, with the storm gone and the moon blazing, two souls and a horse stood together, carrying one memory, one truth. From this moment forward, they were no longer alone. If you were Ruth, holding a truth buried for years, hunted for your silence, would you dare to speak it, knowing it could cost you everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Part 5. The Truth Rises. The western sky peeled open after a long night, slow as a wound splitting to let the first blood-red light seep through. Dawn crawled across the horizon, carving a crimson scar through the thick fog that blanketed the river. The water lay still, no more sandstorm, no more gunfire, yet it carried a chill that pressed against the chest like a hand of iron. Elias stood on the gravel bank, his massive frame weighted, yet unbent. In his scarred hand, he held the silver badge pulled from the river's throat, bent, rusted, still caked with mud, yet under morning light it burned like a bone torn from a grave. His eyes, no longer the hollow eyes of a silent survivor, glowed with the fire of a man who had seen the truth. Maverick stepped close, hooves crunching on stone. The horse lowered its head against Elias's shoulder, breath rising in white streams. All night it had resisted, trembling, refusing the water because it knew. It had smelled the memory buried there. And now, with the truth laid bare, the animal stood firm, calm, like a witness whose duty was done. Ruth crouched beneath a willow, her shawl pulled tight, face streaked with dirt and tears. Her eyes, red and swollen, no longer carried fear. When she looked at Elias now, she saw it plain. He was no longer a man swallowed by shadows. He had found his voice again. Across the prairie, the herd still roared their hooves, drumming broken rhythms into the earth. Last night they stampeded under the crack of rifles. Now their cries still echoed, mingling with the pale dust of morning. It was the West in its truest form, violent, fragile, teaching every living thing how to rise again after the storm. A single shot rang out from a far, sharp hollow, and then silence. Ruth flinched. Elias did not move. He only closed his eyes, drawing a deep breath as though the gunfire were not a threat, but the knock of justice itself. He opened them again. Blood seeped from the cuts in his hand as he clenched the badge tighter. His voice, low and gravel-thick, rolled through the mist. No more silence. The words weren't loud, but they struck the riverbank, Ruth's chest, and even Maverick's heart. They were the beginning of a new dawn, a vow that pain would no longer be a private burden, but a promise of justice. Light spread across the plains, pulling back the dark. The wind carried the taste of gunpowder and sand. The sky cleared, but the ground still trembled with the memory of last night's gunfire and galloping hooves. On a distant ridge, a group of riders had gathered silent, watching. Their horses steamed in the morning fog, their chests heaving. None spoke. They only let smoke curl from their cigarettes, eyes fixed on the man below. In the west, sometimes, a look was a verdict. Ruth's stomach tightened. She had lived under eyes like those before, judging, doubting, banishing without a word. Towns had cast her out on nothing but a glance. But this time she didn't lower her head. Not with Elias beside her. The rancher stood tall, shoulders broad, hand gripping the silver star. He lifted it, turning the badge until sunrise blazed across its tarnished face, flaring straight into the eyes of the men on the ridge. A silent challenge, a statement that needed no words. I know. I see. And I will not bury it again. Maverick snorted, restless ears flicking at every sound, the cattle hooves, the clink of chains drifting on the wind, the invisible bowstring of those riders' stares. Yet instead of backing away, the horse edged closer, shoulder to shoulder with its master. One cowboy on the ridge drew a long drag, exhaled smoke into the wind. His gaze was cold, but laced with something else, acknowledgement. The old ranchers touched the forbidden, his silence seemed to say. No words passed, but together the riders turned their horses. Leather groaned, iron jingled, and one by one they vanished beyond the hill, leaving only a heavy stillness over the river. Ruth exhaled shakily. They won't let this go, she whispered. Elias stared into the emptiness they'd left behind. His gaze sharpened not with fear but resolve. They know the truth has surfaced, and they know I won't bury it again. A final gust swept the bank, carrying the scent of sand and scorched grass. The sun rose full, casting gold across Elias's weathered hair. He stood there solitary, yet unyielding, a lone mark etched against the endless canvas of the prairie. The western sky opened slow after a long night, like a wound splitting to release morning light. From the horizon, a streak of red crawled upward, tearing through fog that smothered the river. The water lay still, no more sandstorm, no more gunfire, yet its cold breath pressed heavy against the chest. Elias sat on the gravel, the crunch of stone beneath his boots echoing in the quiet after the storm. In his hand, the silver badge weighed heavier than iron, carrying years of silence and grief. He set it on his knee and stared. Dawn's light spilled across its scarred, bent surface, across the rust that couldn't dim its gleam. It wasn't just metal. It was testimony. Proof of that night. The mark of the man who stole his family. For years, Elias buried it in his heart, called it fate, called it accident. But truth had always been there, sunk beneath the mud, waiting to rise. The wind carried scents of trampled grass and wet dust. From far off, the echo of stray hooves beat dry as funeral drums. Ruth sat beneath the willow shawl tight around her shoulders. She had already confessed, already stripped her fear bare. Now she waited to see one thing, that Elias would not bury this truth again. Maverick circled tail, flicking eyes glinting in dawn's red light. The horse stopped, struck its hoof against the earth, the sound sharp as a command. Stand. Move forward. Elias lifted his gaze to the rising sun. His eyes burned raw but lit with the fire of a man reborn. His voice rolled deep, rough as canyon wind. I've lived like a dead man too long. Let them steal my voice. Let them call my loss an accident. No more. They will hear the truth. And the man who wore this badge. He raised the rusted star, sunlight flaring through its bent edges. He will face it. Ruth broke into tears, but her sobs weren't fear anymore. They carried relief that someone finally stood beside her, naming the evil she too had endured. The prairie quieted. The storm spent itself. On that riverbank stood a rancher, an outcast woman, and a faithful horse, 3 broken pieces fitting together at last. No more words were needed. It was in their eyes, their breaths in the star, flashing in Elias's hand. Blood welled from his palm, but his grip did not shake. Last night he trembled from grief. This morning he trembled with strength. This was no ending. This was a vow. Light tore through the last veil of mist. Dew on the reeds glimmered gold pink like shards of shattered glass. The whole world blazed, leaving no shadow unchallenged. Elias rose. His long coat flapped in the wind, still powdered with storm dust. He lifted the badge to his eye level, letting sunrise strike through its battered frame. Rusted, bent, but radiant, as if whispering, "I am still here. Truth is still here." Ruth stepped closer, hands, clasped face streaked with tears. Her voice shook but carried steel. "You're not alone. Even if they turn their backs, even if the town throws stones, I won't let you walk into the dark again." Elias met her eyes. No promises, no pretty words, just a slow, firm nod. The nod of a rancher whose word was stronger than ink on paper. Maverick tossed his mane and let out a short, cutting whinny. It rang across the river like nature itself, bearing witness, sealing the unspoken pact between man and woman. Far off, the church bell tolled, rolling long over the prairie. Familiar sound, but today it carried the weight of summons. Ruth stiffened. She knew those streets, those eyes, the judgment waiting there. Yet this time she would not bow her head. Elias slid the badge into his coat pocket. His voice was low, hoarse, but carved in stone. "We're going back. I've hidden long enough. They will hear the truth, whether they want it or not." The wind bent the reeds flat as if bowing before the vow. Ruth wept again, but a faint smile broke through her tears. Elias laid a hand on Maverick's neck, whispering with the calm of a man who'd finally found his ground. Justice never died. It only slept in silence, and today it wakes. The sun had risen fully above the mountains, spilling gold across the riverbank. Mud dried into dark streaks on the stones. Elias stood tall, broad, unbending like an old oak rooted in the prairie wind. In his coat pocket, the silver badge weighed heavy, not as a burden anymore, but as a flame driving him forward. Maverick snorted, mane whipping in the wind, and turned slowly toward the dusty road leading back to town. The horse seemed to know the time had come to face the place Elias had avoided for so many years. Its ears pricked forward, ready for any sound, ally's hoofbeats or an enemy's gunshot. Ruth stepped closer, clutching her worn shawl. Her face was drawn weary from the night, but her eyes carried a new light, the light of someone who had spoken truth, been heard, and now found strength in standing beside another. She looked at Elias, her voice low but firm. "The town won't welcome us, but if you go, I'll go with you." Elias turned his gaze on her. For years, he had only seen loss reflected in other eyes. Now, for the first time, he saw something different: companionship. He gave a slow nod, then set his scarred, calloused hand on Ruth's shoulder. No words, none needed. It was enough to make her break into tears, not of fear, but of recognition. Far across the plain, the cattle herd had quieted. But from town came other sounds: the crack of rifles at practice, the shouts of guards, the grind of wagon wheels on dry earth. They rolled across the prairie like a reminder the West was never gentle, and the road ahead would be lined with trials. Elias turned to Ruth, his voice rough but steady. "No more running. The truth has risen, and justice must be named." Maverick struck the ground with one hoof, the echo ringing across the empty riverbank like a vow carved into stone. Elias took the reins and swung into the saddle. Ruth stepped close, her shawl whipping in the wind, her face lifted toward the same road. The two turned their eyes, fixed on the trail of red dust stretching toward town where the sun had poured its fierce light. In that moment, none of them spoke. They didn't have to. The river, the reeds, the wide prairie all bore witness to a new beginning. Dawn had broken the night, and with it, Elias Carter, the rancher who once lived in silence, had found his voice. Ruth was no longer the outcast left behind. And Maverick, who had trembled before the river, now stood steady. Three fates bound together by a truth pulled from the deep now rode toward justice and perhaps healing. If you were Elias holding the truth in your hands after years buried in silence, would you have the courage to ride back to town and face it all? The truth never dies. Dawn rose high, spilling a golden ribbon across the riverbank, still heavy with mist. Reeds bent in the wind, each drop of dew falling like tiny shards of glass. Elias stood still, his figure washed in pale morning light. Dust clung to his coat, his salt and pepper hair tousled after a sleepless night. In his hand, the silver badge lay cold and heavy like the echo of a memory buried too long. Maverick pressed close, the horse's head resting against his shoulder, breath steaming in soft white clouds. No longer trembling before the river, Maverick's gaze was steady, deep, as if reminding him, "I saw what you tried to forget. And now you see it with me." A few steps away, Ruth gripped her shawl tight. Last night, her tears had been for fear. This morning they fell for relief. In her eyes turned toward Elias there was respect, and something rarer still, trust. Two things she thought she had lost forever. Elias tightened his grip on the badge and bowed his head. His voice, rough and hoarse, carried with the wind. "The truth doesn't die. It only sleeps beneath the river." The words scattered through the air, rippling across the water, weaving through the reeds, pressing into every heart that heard. It was not just a whisper to himself, but a vow to his wife and child, to Ruth, to Maverick, and to the harsh land itself. Justice would come to light. The sun climbed higher, casting long, straight shadows of man, woman, and horse across the stones. Darkness had receded. The night was over, and a new path opened where Elias Carter was no longer the rancher who lived in silence, but the man carrying justice back into town. It's never too late to seek justice. Sometimes it's the loyal animal who sees what humans choose to forget. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always rise again. If you were Elias, would you dare face the memories you buried, or would you ride away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.